Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. If you'd like to jump from one point in the video to another, you can find chapter links down in the video timeline here. So this week I have a bunch of tidbits to tell you about, and I want to talk about my Roaring '20s sweater, which I finally finished. And in conjunction with that, I'm going to answer some questions that some people have asked regarding some of the finishing bits of the sweater. So let's get started. The first tidbit I have comes from, I believe it's called the Scottish Fishing Museum. I'll leave a link down to what it is I'm going to be talking about here. It's a project about basically creating a digital collection of fisherman Gansey sweaters. So these are the kinds of sweaters that fishermen would have worn on the North Sea in certainly the 18th and 19th century, and maybe even as far back as the 17th century, possibly. And so they're collecting examples of sweaters and stitch patterns and actual written patterns and all of that kind of thing as part of this collection. The project will run from June 2020 to 28th February 2021, although we anticipate being the pilot for an ongoing project with a strong legacy involving Ganseys in association with knitting experts Dee Gilpin and Sheila Greenwell. And this would lead to a proposed festival of Ganseys to celebrate our dynamic and interesting Gansey heritage in Scotland. So they want to create this Gansey collection database and a website to showcase our collections, photographs, and knitting patterns. We will highlight the unique history and purpose of Ganseys in fishing communities. We will reach out to our project partners in Fife, the Outer Hebrides, and beyond to gather information on Ganseys held in other museum collections or family homes to create the basis for a Scottish online archive of information and skills. So, a new yarn will be used to develop a new Gansey pattern in collaboration with Dee Gilpin and, I don't know how to pronounce this, Uistwool, U-I-S-T, a combination of virtual webinars, knitting demonstrations, Gansey storage and preservation methods, and interviews will form the event program for knitting the herring. So I'm going to leave a link to the posting about this, which is a lot of what I just read, but there are some email addresses if you want more information. And because I'm not sure, how do you find out about the webinars and all that kind of thing. So I'll leave the links down below, and I'm going to look into this because I would be interested in seeing some of these webinars and what I could learn about, not just about Ganseys, but preserving really old garments, for example. So I think last week I mentioned that there is a company, actually it's here in the Twin Cities, that bought out Craftsy Blueprint, so they're going to be able to keep that streaming service available ongoing. And they're going to, what I saw this week was Craftsy will allow for individual purchase of classes again, as well as subscription-based. So what had happened was Craftsy was you bought classes one at a time, and then when NBC Universal bought them out, they switched to the subscription model where you had access to as many classes as you wanted for the time that on a per month basis. But once you stopped your subscription, you didn't have those classes anymore to look at. And occasionally they would let you keep a class. So it sounds like they're going to have options for either model, which sounds really nice. So I thought I'd update you on that. Last week, I talked about this hand steamer that I was using to, I think I was steaming the collar of my Roaring '20s sweater, and I mentioned how much I liked this steamer, and somebody asked me what kind it was, and I didn't know. I'm up here in my office on the second floor, and the laundry room is down in the basement, and that's where the steamer is. And I just didn't feel like going down there. And the reason I didn't know, just off the top of my head, what the brand was, is because I didn't shop for this steamer. It was like I had in my head I needed a new hand steamer because I'd been trying to use my iron and it wasn't working. And I had an old sort of big steamer. It's like a floor model that I hated. It's actually sitting in the corner here. I need to get rid of it. So I had in the back of my mind at some point I wanted to get a steamer. I hadn't looked into them at all. And we were at Costco walking down an aisle, and there they had one. And if you're familiar with Costco, they don't have 10 kinds of, of any particular appliance. They will have one. Sometimes they'll have two, two different things that will be quite different from each other. So the one thing is if it's at Costco, it's going to be a good brand, whatever it is, it's going to be good. And so I saw it, I'm like, ooh, steamer, I need a steamer. And I bought it and I love it. So I was just using, so it's kind of warm. So it's this handheld variety right here. It's got this little switch right here, so you can take the reservoir out like that. So you fill this up with distilled water, and then it goes back in. There's an on-off button right here, so that will kind of heat things up so they get ready. And then there's this little display. These light up. I don't have this plugged in right now, but these will light up, and then it'll go solid when it's ready for steam. And you can control how much steam. You can push this button multiple times and the lights will change color. But once this steam button is pressed, it's just going to be shooting steam out. So you can just have it sit there and you can hold something in front of it, or you can have it go up and down, and you can turn it all different angles. And there's some sort of thing to create creases or something, of pleats, or I don't really understand because I don't need it for that. So what I mostly use it for is steaming swatches. And I've been using it for the sweater too, to steam those little crochet squares to get them to lie flat. And so when I'm doing a technique video and I'm knitting a sample, a lot of times if it's in stockinette, well, all the time, if it's in stockinette, it's going to be curling up and rolling. And I want it to be flatter so that when I'm demonstrating on the needles in the video, it's not going to be all curled up. And so I'll use the steamer and it will just completely relax the fabric, and I can even pin it until it dries, and it doesn't take very long to dry. With a normal project, I would do regular, completely soak the item, squeeze the water out, lay it flat, get it to the dimensions I want, and let it dry. That's going to take, if it's a sweater or something like that, a good 24 hours before it would dry. I can sometimes shorten that by having a fan blow on it. So that's not something I want to do for swatches. I want to just steam it and give it 10 minutes to dry so that I can then do my video. But steaming is also nice after you have completed like a wet soak blocking. Then you can do some final, really finishing touches with a steamer as well. The brand name is Conair. And I don't know what sort of, here's model GS76XGD. I'll put that down in the description, and if I can find it on Amazon, I'll put a link to it so that you can read about it. But this is the steamer I have that I just love. So this section is really a bit about Hamilton, the musical. Many people watched Hamilton on Disney Plus this past weekend when it was released, and I was one of them. I made sure that I finished my Roaring Twenties sweater. I didn't have all the ends woven in, but I had all the knitting done. I had all of the seaming done, and then I went and I watched Hamilton, and I loved it. But what I wanted to tell you about were two videos that are related to Hamilton, but are also related to how vintage or antique clothing was fitted to the body, which I think is really interesting. So the first one is from a YouTuber called Bernadette Banner. And so she is really enamored of Victorian era clothing. And Victorian era spans many, many decades, so fashion's changed quite a lot over that time period. But that seems to be what she's really focused on. And she will recreate garments from that period using the tools that would have been available at the time that particular garment would have originally been made. So sometimes that means hand sewing, and sometimes that might mean she can use a sewing machine where she's cranking it with the arm in order to make it go. So it can be really interesting. She really knows her stuff. She has a very specific way of speaking. She enunciates very clearly, and some people might think it's, well, I would say her speech is a little affected, but I think she really is trying to embody and live in the Victorian style. Like, sure, her clothes are all Victorian style clothing. And so she lived for a time in the UK. She is American, but she'll say whilst instead of while. But she'll also say, well, I will tell you about that anon, meaning I will tell you about that soon, which is a really archaic way of speaking. Nobody speaks that way anymore. So she really is trying to, like, envision herself in this 19th century frame of mind while doing really high quality production videos. So she sometimes will talk about the costuming in different films, and she'll talk about what they did well versus what they really messed up, and like how a particular dress has nothing at all to do with the time period in which the movie takes place. So she was talking about the costuming in Hamilton, and she actually thought they did an amazing job, but she talked about sort of the liberties they took in order to allow the actors to move, because they have to do a lot of movement. So she talked about the costuming for the women and also for the men. And one of the things that she talked about was that when clothing was custom made for people, when people were not buying ready to wear a couple hundred years ago, everything was custom made for people. And so the sleeves were much more closely fitted. And one of the things that they did was that the armhole was set much further back on the arm. And what that caused the body to do was to have the chest forward. And so the particularly military officers would have had coats that would be cut that way, because it would force the chest to come out like that. And so the way clothing was cut would help to emphasize the posture in whatever was the way that was deemed appropriate. But it also didn't necessarily allow for movement. And so one of the things she talked about was gussets. And I thought, if for some of you who might have been interested in gussets and how they work, you might be interested in that, because I did put some gussets in my 1920s sweater that weren't called for in the pattern. And it was because I was worried about how tight that underarm was going to be on my body. And so that is really interesting. I'll leave a link to her video down there. Her whole channel is really interesting. So you might enjoy a lot of her other videos as well. The second video that I'm linking to down below is one by Adam Savage. He is one of the two guys that used to do that show Mythbusters. And he has a previous, in earlier life, he was a prop master type of person for various productions. And so he went backstage to the San Francisco company of Hamilton and was talking to the actor who played King George and talking about the very specifics of his costuming. And they again talked about the way that the sleeves would have been cut to cause the chest to go forward. So that's interesting. So if you're just interested in how they do all of the wigs and everything for that show, that might be interesting as well. But they did also talk about those armholes in that video. So finally, the thing I want to say about Hamilton is that I remember when I was hearing about Hamilton a couple of years ago, and what you hear about it is that fundamentally it's a story about Alexander Hamilton, but also it's about his competition with Aaron Burr throughout their lives. They had a lot of similarities in their lives, but there were a lot of differences in terms of how they chose to live their lives, and that was kind of the conflict between the two. But I remember when I was kind of reading about Alexander Hamilton a couple of years ago, and I was thinking about Aaron Burr, and I kept thinking, Burr. That name is so familiar on my tree. And because one of the other things that I'm really passionate about is doing family history research and genealogy. And I've been doing it for, I think, at least 10 years now. And I got started on it thinking there wouldn't be much to find, that I could do like a free trial of Ancestry and I'd find everything there was to know about my family, because I figured they were all illiterate farmers and there wouldn't be much of a paper trail. But what I was really interested in discovering was who the immigrants were in my family tree, because my husband had grandparents and great-grandparents who came to this country as immigrants through Ellis Island. And so they had the stories to some extent. We knew who the people were who came through, and we didn't have any immigrant stories in my family. We actually had one, and it was my second great-grandfather on my maternal grandmother's side. My grandma's father, my great-grandfather, was born during the Civil War. And he had a phenomenal memory. And in the 1940s, on his 70th birthday, he dictated his life story to my grandmother, and she typed it up. And part of that was he told about his father and how he came from what is now Germany. It was a principality called Lippe-Detmold at the time. And that he had been illiterate and he came here and he was able to do all of these things he wouldn't have been able to do in Germany, like getting married and owning his own farm and having a family and all of that. So that was the only immigrant story we had, but I assumed everybody came over in the 1800s, which is what a lot of people's families are like. Very soon, after starting to do family history research, like the very first night I started doing it, I realized we didn't have any immigrant stories because they came very, very early on. They came in the 1600s, many of them. I have a few that came in the 1800s, but most of them came in the 1600s. And what that means is when you hear about a person from that time period that has a particular surname and you have that surname on your family tree, it's very likely that they were related somehow. So I did an exploration about a name from the colonial period. I think it was last year. I'll put a link to it. It was I had bought this book called Favorite Mittens. And it's about these traditional knitting patterns from like the maritime provinces of Canada, and as well as sort of the northeastern states like Maine in the United States. So those areas are all near each other. And about the mitten patterns that were pretty unique to that area, and then some of the really common stitch patterns. And there was a mitten in here that had a pattern that was called something like Chapman. I think it was called the Chapman mitten pattern. And I was reading the information about it, and it talked about how it was named after this particular guy who had been a British loyalist and had moved to Canada after the England lost the Revolutionary War. And I thought, oh, I have that name on my family tree. And so I went and I figured out who that guy was and what his ancestry was. And then I found the person named Chapman on my tree and looked back. And then I figured out how we were related. And I'm like, oh, it's really like a traditional mitten pattern that I could feel like I was connected to. And so that's the kind of thing I like to do sometimes when I'm finding things that are knitting related or textile related or something, is sometimes I want to find that connection on my family tree. So after I watched Hamilton, I had this memory that I'd looked up Burr on my family tree before and had tried to figure out how we might be related. And there was some confusion because so many names are repeated from one generation to another. But I spent Monday like figuring this out. And so I finally figured out how I am related to Aaron Burr. So he is my third cousin 5 times removed. So the way this works is I track myself back in the Burr line, and I tracked Aaron Burr back in his Burr line until I found the common ancestor. And it was this guy named Jehu Burr who was born in like 1596. And he had a son also named Jehu Burr, but he had another son that was named Daniel. So the elder Jehu and his kids, his family, came here to the colonies, and then they settled here. So Aaron Burr is descended from the second Jehu Burr, and I am descended from the second Jehu Burr's brother, Daniel. And so the way you figure out what kind of cousin you are is you look at the second Jehu Burr and Daniel are siblings, and their children are first cousins to each other. Their children are second cousins to each other, and so on. And so you keep going down the generations until you get to the location where the person is that you want to match up to. So in my case, it was Aaron Burr. So on his tree, we stop when we get to him. And so he is third cousins to one of my ancestors. But we have to keep coming down my family tree until we get to me. So we have that third cousin relationship. And now we're only traveling down the family tree on my line. So every generation means I'm a third cousin, 1 time removed, 2 times removed, 3 times removed, etc., until we get to me. And so that's how I figured out that I am third cousins, 5 times removed, to Aaron Burr, who shot Alexander Hamilton. Okay, so my Roaring '20s sweater is finished. I wanted to just kind of talk over why I knit this thing and then kind of how I feel about it now that it's actually complete. So this sweater is really part of a larger long-term project that I started working on about 1.5 years ago. It started with this Edwardian sweater pattern that I'd found in an old digitized newspaper. And I was so intrigued by the silhouette that I decided to read through the pattern because it was such an interesting silhouette. And I thought, how did they achieve that with knitting? And I read through and I could understand the knitting part of it. What I couldn't understand is how it was all sewn together at the end, how it all came together, because it started at the back like this sweater did, came over the shoulders like this sweater did, but the sleeves weren't cast on for it. It just came up to the back, then over the shoulders to the front. But there was a lot of really interesting shaping going on in the front in order to achieve that Edwardian silhouette, and there was a ton of fabric. There was as much fabric on each half of the front as there was on the back, and the neck was really closely fit. And I was trying to figure out, how did you sew the neck on to the 2 fronts? How were the 2 fronts coming together in such a way that you could put that sweater on and have the neck be attached? I couldn't figure it out. I couldn't picture it in my head. And all I had was a drawing to go on. There was not a lot of detail. And the finishing instructions were not helpful at all. So I started knitting that sweater with no intention of finishing it or wearing it. I just knit it the way the instructions said. I didn't worry about what size it was. And I knit through it, and eventually I was learning so much more than I expected. I did answer, sort of, I think, the question that I initially had was, how does that all come together in the front? But I learned so much more from that experience of knitting a sweater that had a very different construction process and that used techniques in very different ways than I was used to. I learned so much from that process, and I started reading all of these vintage and antique patterns and looking for old manuals to try to figure out what techniques would have been used when they're not saying how they're seaming something together, like just trying to put all that information together. And I realized that just the way fashion evolved in the 20th century, so too did the construction techniques of knitting sweaters in the 20th century. And I felt like there was a lot to learn from not just those construction methods, but in how they used familiar techniques in different ways and how they may have used a different version of a technique that we would use today. Like how did they do short row shaping differently than how we might use them today? And so I thought that was a really valuable learning opportunity. And one of the things I love most about knitting is that I am able to learn something new every day. Even after having completed the Master Hand Knitting program, I didn't stop learning. In fact, I think I've learned at least as much since completing the program as I learned during the process of going through that program. To me, that was like a really great opportunity to learn more, because if I'm knitting from contemporary patterns, I'm being handheld, there's more tutorials. If I'm designing something myself, I'm designing it based on what I already know about how construction techniques work. So I just felt like there was a lot to learn from these sweaters. So I made some rules about the vintage sweaters I was going to make. First of all, the rule would be it would have to be something I would wear, because I wasn't going to knit another sweater, like take all the time like I did with the Edwardian sweater and end up with something that I couldn't wear. I love knitting sweaters, but I don't want to only knit sweaters I'm never going to wear. So one of the rules was it has to be something I would wear. And the second rule was it has to have something new or different in how it's constructed or in the techniques that are used that will teach me something that I can't find in contemporary sweater making. So I found a World War I sweater. It was not that hard to knit, and it had a shawl collar. I was really envious of the shawl collars in the early 20th century. I liked them so much more than the shawl collars we have today. And the sweater was pretty straightforward to knit. I was excited to learn how to knit the shawl collar, and it turned out that was what was missing from this pattern. Was there was a printer's error, and there's a big chunk of the pattern which just was not there, and I had to figure out how that shawl collar was knit using only the very last line of the instructions for the collar. So my plan was I would go the 1900s, the 1910s, the 1920s. I would go all the way through in a progression. But when I hit the 1920s, fashion really changed in the 1920s, and there were a huge number of different silhouettes and styles and colors being used, and the techniques for constructing sweaters were much more varied than they were earlier in the century. And so I didn't have any trouble finding something that I would want to wear. But the things that I found that I wanted to wear, like a tuxedo sweater, I just love those. Very simple to knit, nothing to learn from them. So this is a sweater I saw very early on. I saw this sweater like a year ago, and I was instantly drawn to it. But I felt like it violated one of the key rules, which was it had to be a sweater that I would wear. And I didn't. This to me looked more like a costume. It didn't really look like a sweater I would just wear. Like maybe I would wear it to a knitting event or something. But so I was really hesitant to even get into it. But I was so drawn to the colors and the shapes. People have mentioned in the comments all kinds of things that this sweater reminds them of. The most recent one was it looks very 1980s, and it kind of does. I mean, I was in my 20s in the 1980s, and that may be something that appealed to me, was that it looked like something I would have worn when I was in my 20s, and this sweater was designed in the 20s and probably meant to be worn by a young woman as well. So that may have been part of it. I liked the colors. I liked the shapes. One of the things that was kind of a deterrent was the fact that the collar and the wristbands were going to be crocheted, and I'm not a crocheter. I knew the rudiments of it, but I didn't really care for crochet, and I didn't know that I wanted to do that. And again, my goal is to knit this or to construct it and make it as much as possible in the way that the pattern instructions tell you to. So my goal was not, just to end up with some squares that were about that size. I can do that in garter stitch. No, the idea was to create it in the way that it was originally designed, making modifications for fit, because I did want it to fit me. Those were some things that kind of kept me from wanting to knit this sweater at the very beginning. And so there were a couple of other ideas I had for the 1920s, and I just couldn't make a decision. I think I couldn't say no to this sweater, and yet I didn't feel right about saying yes to it. So I went to the 1930s. I knit that sweater at end of last summer and into the early fall. And so in January, the All Things Vintage group on Ravelry was deciding on what their knit along was going to be. They do a knit along, typically they do a knit along from January to June, and then they do another one from July to December, and everybody throws out ideas for what would be a fun knit along. And we decided that it was the 2020s, so it would be fun to do the Roaring 20s. And then I'm like, okay, that's going to force me. I want to do this. I want to join the knit along. I want to just choose what my 1920s sweater is going to be. And I decided to go with this, even though I had reservations about it. So when I was finishing this up last weekend, I actually finished weaving up the ends before I started recording here, but the sewing and everything was finished up. I was so happy. I was so happy about it. I was really excited to try the sweater on. So I put it on and I went into the bathroom and I kind of went, I'm underwhelmed, because it's like I look at it and I'm like, yeah, this looks kind of silly. It looks like a costume. I'm not going to go out and wear this somewhere, which is kind of what I suspected, but I had all this excitement from finishing it that I kind of felt a little bit let down. Also, it's very hot, and so when I'm wearing it for more than 60 seconds, I just want it off me. So the collar, you know, is another thing. It's a close-fitting neck, as they were back in the early part of the 20th century, and getting that crocheted collar to lay flat, it would be like, you know, just constantly fiddling with it. I like looking at it. I'm really happy with the modifications I made to make it fit and planning it out. I did one other thing. Somebody asked about in the comments. They said, because I had created these gussets a couple weeks ago, which I'll link to, you know, how I did that. And I made a gusset in, can you see that? Let's see, let me turn this. You can see there's kind of that triangular shape on the sleeve. That's a gusset to make the arm a little bit bigger around at the top without interfering with the circumference at the base. And then I did a shorter triangular gusset in the body. And when I finished it, I was like, it looks kind of weird, but you know, it'll be hidden because it's right in the underarm. And it wasn't until I took a photograph of what I had done and posted it to the All Things Vintage group in Knit Along thread that I looked at the photograph and I thought, oh, what's weird is that I've interrupted the black stripes in that triangle is just a solid color and the stripes are interrupted. I could maybe do some duplicate stitch across the gusset and to kind of connect those stripes. And somebody mentioned that in the comments last week. They said, "Oh, I know you're really particular about stripes when you do socks. Would you maybe do duplicate stitch on those gussets to keep the stripes lined up?" So I was going to do that. I thought, yes, good idea. I do want to do that. And then I looked at how I'd sewn. I hadn't quite sewn the gusset in exactly right. So if I were to take the stripe at one edge and the row that matched up with the black stripe on one edge, and I duplicate stitched all the way across, I would be off. It wouldn't be in the same row, wouldn't line up. And I thought, well, okay, so I have three choices. One is to just leave it the way it is and not care that it's not sewn in exactly right and not try to put the stripes in at all. The second thing would be to take the seaming out, do the duplicate stitch, and then re-seam it in and line the stripes up. I'm willing to do duplicate stitch. I don't particularly enjoy it, and it creates the fabric extra thick at that point, and there's all kinds of things about it I don't like. And I thought, if I'm going to take the seams out anyway, it's just a small little triangle. I'll just rip the triangle out, the gusset back, and re-knit it and knit the stripes in it, and then I can re-sew it in and everything will be lined up. So that is what I did. And so the gusset, the triangular gusset, is right here, and I've lined it up with the original stripes, so you can't tell too much unless you come very close and look at the seams, and I'll do an overhead shot so you can see what this looks like up close. So that was something I changed from last week, and I was much happier having done that rather than leaving that white. Even though, like I said, when you're wearing it, I don't think anybody would have been able to see that. I just felt like I put so much work into this. I might as well do the best job that I can. So I want to talk about some of the things that I learned from doing this project, because that's the goal, is to learn something. I always have certain things in mind that I want to learn, and then I always learn additional things. So the yarn that was called for in this pattern is not a yarn that is a type of yarn that is available anymore. It's called Shetland floss. But this was a yarn that was it's a particular type of yarn, and it was very popular from at least the 1880s. I saw some ads for Shetland floss in 1880s catalog, all the way up to about 1960. So huge, at least that period of time, it was hugely popular. Every yarn company had a Shetland floss of one sort or another. And the only thing this pattern book said was that it was to be worked at 5 stitches per inch. It told a needle size, and then you were going to get 5 stitches per inch. So I don't care what the needle size is. I care what the gauge is, because, you know, their vintage needle size may not match something today, but I know what needle sizes I need in order to get 5 stitches per inch. And I know what kind of yarn typically gives you 5 stitches per inch. That's worsted weight yarn. But one of the first things the pattern stated was to use 2 strands of the Shetland floss, and then you were supposed to work this garter stitch band here, and then you work the body of the sweater. It never said to cut the 2 strands. Some of the patterns in this book said to use 2 strands of Shetland floss for the hem, and then they would tell you to cut it at the end of the hem. And so one of the things I puzzled about at the beginning was why they wanted 2 strands, you know, what was going on. I even went so far as to buy some vintage Shetland floss off of eBay so I could see what that kind of yarn was like and why, so that would inform me a little bit more about what the original sweater was supposed to be knit like. And it turned out that, at least what I think that this Shetland floss was a woolen spun fingering weight yarn. And woolen spun yarns that are kind of open and airy have a much wider range of gauges that they can be worked at. So it can also be doubled up and worked compressed as a worsted weight. When you combine 2 fingering weight yarns together, you get a worsted weight. There is a yarn on the market that would be very similar to that, one of the Brooklyn Tweed woolen spun fingering weight yarns. I don't know if it's Shelter or if it's the other one, if Shelter is the worsted weight, but they've got 2 types of woolen spuns in 2 different weights, and the thinner one can be combined to make a thicker one. So that would be a similar, and they also mentioned that there's a much wider range of gauges that yarn can be knit at, because it has so much air. It's not going to have as much drape. It's going to just have more body. So what I eventually realized was that the reason they never said to cut the 2 strands is because they intended for it to be used for the entire sweater. Now, I had bought worsted weight yarn thinking this was supposed to be knit with worsted weight yarn, and technically it was. The 2 strands of fingering would make worsted weight. The problem was with the crochet bits, which did not call for 2 strands. So the crochet bit was to be worked on a pretty fine crochet hook in order to make these kind of thin and flat bits. And so because I didn't have fingering weight yarn that I was doubling, I needed to take worsted weight yarn that I separated. So I learned how to unply yarn using my spinning wheel to help unply it, and I figured out how much of that I could do at any given time and keep it from tangling, because once I split the 2 sets of plies, I had to let it hang and twist back on itself so it would sort of reply. And I had to figure out what I could do, and I realized I could do a little more than 6 yards. I could do about 6.5 yards that I could split, that I could actually manage to do, and that would be enough to work a square. And so that was something I had to learn. And I had to learn really how to get much better at crochet, and learn how when you get to the end of a crochet row, it does matter which way you turn the work. I didn't realize that at first. I learned some nice techniques for creating these really crisp lines for the outlines. I spent a lot of time working on the crochet and practicing and trying different things because I wanted the nicest look that I could get. So those are some things I learned. The other thing I learned was that this this tendency to design patterns in one size, which was true for vintage and antique patterns. Oftentimes, it's very easy to size things up and by just adding a few stitches here or knitting to an extra length there. But this sweater was very difficult to modify because any change that you might want to make in length is going to impact everything else. Like you couldn't just add an inch worth of extra fabric. You had to add a whole motif stripe and a plain stripe to the length. And likewise, I had trouble with figuring out how to modify the sleeve so that it would fit around my arm, because if I added extra circumference at the upper arm, that would add it at the lower arm, and that would make this just huge at the bottom. So these were all things I had to juggle, and it really affirmed something that I have known from when I've just designed something very specific to my own body, and people have seen it go, oh, that's so gorgeous, you should release the pattern. And I look at it and I think, oh my God, there's no way to grade this in a way that's going to work. And then people wouldn't be able to modify, the sweater to fit them if they needed to. So this is something that modern contemporary designers kind of have to keep in mind is when they come up with a design, how do you scale it up? And these days they want you to scale it for 12 or 16 different sizes, and which is not easy. And so something like this, they got away with because it was one size. They didn't have to try to make it work for multiple sizes. And I have often wondered if anybody else ever knit this sweater, and if they did they just knit it exactly as written, or did they try to modify it themselves to make it fit their own bodies? Because there was no information about fit in terms of length of anything. All there was here's how you knit this pattern, and you basically were stuck with a very specific number of rows, but they didn't tell you what the number of rows was. So there was a lot of work to just figure out what this original sweater was going to look like, and then what did I need to do to modify it. So it was a real challenge, but it was a fun challenge for me. One of the reasons I wanted to knit this, the things that appealed to me, was the way that these sleeves were designed and the way they worked. I'd never seen anything like this with these slashes at the bottom. And I was just fascinated by that, and ultimately wanted to know what the sleeve proportion was in order to get the right poof. And I didn't quite guess right. I knew I had to modify it to make it longer, because the way it was written, it would have ended about up to here on me. So that was a trick, was figuring out and understanding what length I needed, and what properties of the sweater in terms of circumference and the slashes and the length contributed to the amount of puff that you got. And so that was something I couldn't look up anywhere. There was nothing else like it. Again, another reason to knit this is because it's not something I could learn from a contemporary sweater. So somebody wondered if it would have been possible to modify the length by making the wristband narrower, but that would have really messed with the proportions relative to the collar, because these squares were exactly the same as the squares inside the outline here. So I would have ended up with something a lot narrower, which I think aesthetically, you have to balance these things with the aesthetics. So otherwise, the only thing I could have done would be to literally chop off some of this and like serge the ends or something. The slashes then would have been shorter. So there's not really a practical way, and because I'm not particularly concerned about actually wearing this, it's not something that I am going to change. Somebody else asked, how did I sew the sleeve to the wristband, because the edge of the sleeve was 11 inches in length altogether when you add up all of the sections, but the wristband was only about 7 inches. And on top of that, you've got crochet on one half made with very tiny stitches, and you've got knitting on the other half, which is much larger stitches. Basically what I did was I divided up the wristband into sections. I divided up into half. Actually, I divided it up into 4/4. So half of the sleeve is the back side. So this is half of the measurement, and this is right up the middle. And then the other half of the sleeve are these two sections right here. So I divided the wristband up into 4 equal quarters, and I sewed each of those long bits to those shorter bits. And I did it by taking 1 stitch from the crochet side and then sewing it to 2 selvage stitches in most cases on the knit side. So it's just a proportion thing. How many stitches do I have on the short side and how many stitches do I have on the long side, and how do I match those up so that they come out evenly. So the next question is, what am I going to knit next? Well, the next decade is going to be the 1940s. And if you've been watching my channel this year, you will know that I acquired this whole shelf worth of vintage knitting books this year. Many of them are from the 1940s. And then I have a few other booklets on another shelf that are from the late 30s and early 1940s. And so I will probably take a sweater from one of these British knitting books, and there's tons of sweaters in there to choose from. Again, they're all in one size, but these books, as well as the booklets I bought from the late 30s and early 40s, have a method of modifying that they teach in there that uses a grid-based schematic. So you could do a full-size, life-size schematic if you wanted to, or you could use something that was on a scale so that each square represented a ½ inch or something. And I just think it would be interesting to then make the modifications, which I will undoubtedly have to do, using that approach of this schematic and the way that they plan things. So that's my idea for 1940s. I don't know what sweater I will choose to do. I haven't figured that part out yet, but it will likely be something from one of those books. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.